Kansas City's grand parks and boulevard system came about in part because of the City Beautiful movement in the late 1800s.
Yeah, the idea that art and aesthetics could really make people's lives better takes many forms. The Urban Canvas Project has, for example, chosen plywood.
KC Parks and Rec, Arts Tech, and the No Violence Alliance have been working together to fight blight in the Prospect Corridor, calling on artists to create works that will embellish the vacant houses in the area.
On a Saturday in August, artists and organizers gathered at the Workhouse Castle on Vine to choose the winning works in plywood.
It's about the content of your character and not your skin color. That's what Martin Luther King Jr. said. You're welcome.
My name is Sergeant Garrick Haynes, and I work for Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. We're out at 2100 Vine. Now, we want to bring attention to a lot of the abandoned properties in the city and also teach some young artists some different skill sets on how to plan their future with their artwork.
When I grew up, I want to be an art teacher because I like drawing and I like looking at art.
We've got a group called the CRT, which is Community Response Team. And what we do is we sit down with them once a month and we talk about the problems in their neighborhoods. And one of the main problems that came up was the blight and the abandoned properties and the crime that goes on around these abandoned properties.
If you're driving down the street and you see an abandoned house, you're gonna think, oh, it's nasty, but if we put our paintings on there, it's gonna look decent and nice.
On the flip side of that, we're trying to get some of our at-risk youth out of the neighborhoods and into better programs. So we decided to combine the two problems, and we came up with this program.
I love art. It's a way to express yourself and show everybody how you feel, because not everybody can tell people how they feel, you know.
My artwork is about saving the city and putting it on every house in the city.
My piece is the one that says equality. In the system today, there really isn't any, you know, with the police and stuff. Well, some of the police, not all of them, and how they act toward certain people of different races. And at the bottom of it, it's everybody of every different race, and they're holding up the city and supporting it. We can fix it easily if we all basically go colorblind.
We've given 2 scholarships away with the Nelson Atkins Art Museum, and that's going to be a year's worth of workshops for the 2 winners of that scholarship.
What I got out of this artwork is a scholarship to Nelson Atkins Museum of Art and a job at My Arts Tech.
When you're working together, that's how you form your community. This was a beautification effort. This was also a way to raise awareness of the abandoned homes and how we need to get people living back in them and fix them up.
What's that saying? One picture is 1,000 words. Put that in there too, because that was nice. That's gold.